Hello, and thank you all for joining this month's Transform IT Hangout. Our show is brought to you by the Intel IT Center and the IT Transformation Institute. My name is Corinne Buchanan, and I will be facilitating today's conversation. Before we begin, I want to remind you that you can use the hashtag TransformIT if you have any questions or comments throughout the show, and we'll get to them either live or later today. So we really would love to hear your input. I now am going to hand over the conversation to our host, Charles Araujo, who will introduce our guests and start today's conversation.
Thanks, Corinne. Well, here we are. We are on another Hangout, and I really love doing these. We get to have such great conversation to kind of take these interviews and these shows to another level. And today we're going to be talking about the many facets of one of my favorite subjects, learning. So joining us today are Doug Tedder, Principal at Tedder Consulting, and Will Lasselle, CIO of the Mohican Band of Indians, who are both in much cooler weather than I am, and so we were enjoying kind of playing with that a little bit. So wave, guys, say hi. On our most recent episode, Jeff Tunn, who's the CIO of Goodwill Industries of Central Indiana, shared with us his views on learning, specifically on how he has approached the idea of lifelong learning and how he's attempted to embed this concept into his management style and his leadership approach. He ended the interview with a statement that I thought was actually pretty prescient, and that is, in fact, I literally used it with a client yesterday, that learning itself may be one of the most critical skills of the future. And so I think this is going to be an important topic for us to chat about today. So let's go and dive in. In this first clip, Jeff is going to start on a personal level and discuss why it's important to take self-inventory and focus on overcoming weaknesses, which sometimes is counter to what we hear from the management gurus. So I think it's going to be an interesting kind of foundation for learning growth. So let's play the clip and take it from there.
A leader today, well, probably any time, is you have to understand your strengths and weaknesses. You know, look at yourself without any of the guises of self-deception, right? And you could take the Drucker approach, which is basically accentuate your positives and the negatives will become irrelevant, right? I think that's true to a certain extent, but the other thing that I've done is I've kind of looked at those weaknesses and said, you know, in order for me to do what I want to do, there's some things in there that I have to attack. A great example was I would hate doing presentations, even for a project team, people that I knew, much less getting up in front of a crowd of strangers and talking. And it was like, in order to be the leader and the CIO that I want to be, I'm going to have to be able to do that. So I would purposely sign up for networking groups that made you, as part of being a part of the group, get up and talk about yourself, talk about your company. I'd go to networking events. I put myself in situations where I was presenting to Rotary clubs all over Central Indiana, and had nothing to do with IT, but everything to do about getting up in front of people. You know, I still get nervous, but now I get energized from the nervousness instead of petrified from the nervousness. So that was one example of taking a weakness and really focusing on it to turn it into a strength.
So what I thought was interesting about this is he mentioned Drucker, and there's other folks that have talked about this, that when you are focused on your negatives, that you end up, you know, sometimes really ending in this negative cycle because you're working on something that's hard for you versus accentuating those positives and you know, kind of doubling down on the bright spots. But he brought up, I thought, a really interesting point that without focusing on overcoming some of those things that are holding you back, that it can hold you back. So I'm curious, Will, we'll start with you. I mean, have you experienced that, or I'm curious, just one way or the other, which way have you approached it, and what results have you found?
Charlie, and I really like that clip from Jeff, and I think it was spot on from my perspective and my personal experiences. You know, I do take that inventory, and as I was gearing myself to follow the CIO path and get to the goals that I've achieved so far and the ones I have in the future, it really is seeing what my weak points are, and I solicit a lot of feedback from mentors, from my superiors at organizations, and then what I do is I work to not necessarily make it a strength, but to strengthen those weaknesses. But I really do focus as well as the positives, because it's sort of, you know, those are my strengths. I mean, if people say, hey, I'm a great team leader, I'm good with technical skills and being able to lead discussions with engineers and administrators and stuff. I know that's good. That's what I'm good at. That's my wheelhouse. I'm really going to still play up to that, but at the same time, kind of to become that 5-tool player, to use a baseball analogy now. It's okay. I got to work on my fielding. I got to work on I got to work on my fielding and stuff like that. So hey, what I'm going to do is after practice, I'm going to take a couple more grounders and stuff like that. So with respects to my career and technology, that's what I look for. The most glaring one I can see was public speaking, and so what I did with that was just really force myself to go out there, public speak, join Toastmasters, and really just kind of take that approach. And it made something that to me was a negative because I was fearful about it. I learned techniques, and that positive reinforcement from my peers in those organizations really helped me to enhance the public speaking. So I wouldn't say it's a strength yet. It's still something I'm working on, but just having that knowledge of self to know my strengths and my limitations and work on them with the learning aspect is just great. So I love what Jeff's son was saying.
Well, I know that it reminds me, because I think one of the challenges we all have is to balance. I mean, I think the advice that Drucker has of focusing on the good and accentuating the positive is important, because it really does, to your point, Will, right? I mean, it's about how do you reinforce those things that are already in your wheelhouse. But by the same token, there are things that are going to hold us back. I'm reminded back before the fall of Tiger Woods, there was this moment where he was at the top of his game, and he pulled off of the circuit for like 6 months and completely retooled his driving swing with his coach, and literally unlearned everything and kind of relearned it, because he felt that was his weakness and that he could get better. And I was like taken by this. So Doug, I'm curious from your perspective. You actually, I know, recently got to spend some time with Jeff. How you've seen this, and if your conversation with him flavored that conversation any further.
Yeah, I thought it was. I had the pleasure of having coffee with Jeff earlier this week, and just to hear the enthusiasm in his voice around this continual learning mentality. I share that same mentality, and I think a lot of the things that he was saying around getting energy from that nervousness when you're addressing a weakness, I have found personally to be very powerful. I agree. I think if you rely only on your strengths, I think in a way, it will take you so far. But I think in a way, it does in fact hold you back, because you become, in my mind, I've become fearful of becoming complacent. I would become, maybe just kind of mail it in now and again, that kind of thing. And that doesn't help me. That doesn't help the folks around me. So when he talks about this whole idea of continual learning, and yeah, you leverage your strengths, and I agree what Will says there. You want to leverage those strengths, but I find particular energy from taking that nervous energy, taking that doubt around things where I'm not so strong, or where I have opportunities, and using that to really motivate me to develop some of those areas and skills that I just don't think I play as well in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we run the risk, all of us, right? Especially, I think the better you get at something, the more you want to keep focusing on it. And yes, you want to continually get better at that as well, but if we don't broaden our horizons and look at those areas, then we're going to get stuck in that rut, to your point. So I think it's an interesting area that can be challenging for a lot of folks. I think that it's also funny, or maybe the other perspective on it is that what I really appreciated about really everything Jeff had to say, but as we segue here, was that I think many of us think of learning sometimes as this thing that's thrust upon us. When we start out in life, we're sent to school, and there's this expectation. We go to college, and it's just kind of it's not this thing where we necessarily put it up on ourselves, or at least I think for a lot of folks. And what I really loved is that Jeff, and both on camera, off camera, we had these conversations, and he really takes this methodical approach to learning. Not only in terms of taking an inventory, which it sounds like we've all done to a certain degree, but just this active choice that he took, that this wasn't kind of waiting for it to come to him. It was saying, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? What's holding me back? That's the inventory part. And then, therefore, choosing on, what it is that he had to do to get to the next point that he wanted to get to. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded intro to actually what's going to be a long clip, so I'll warn you now. But I just thought it was really kind of interesting. So, Kern, let's play the next clip.
Great example. A few years ago, we embarked on a series of cloud projects here at Goodwill, and one of the things we did was we went Google. Just a fun fact to know and tell, we actually went live on Super Bowl Sunday when the Super Bowl was here. And that was what the project team decided would be a great day to go live, because who's going to be doing email after the Super Bowl, right? And oh, by the way, although it was a different Manning that beat Brady, it was still great to see a Manning beat Brady in the Super Bowl. So anyway, so our systems engineer at the time was really heavily involved in the project, but he came to me 2 weeks later and resigned. And his reason was he really saw himself as an exchange guy. That embodied his entire professional career, to develop an exchange and to maintain the exchange. And when we went Google, he didn't see himself in the future, right? So contrast that with a few years later, we're continuing down this path, and our next systems engineer that replaced that gentleman, I go to him and say, gosh, we want to do disaster recovery in the cloud. What do you think about that? He's like, that sounds pretty interesting. Let me dig in and learn about it. He ended up architecting the whole thing, running the entire project, and then he says to me, well, what about our production servers? Why don't we move those to the cloud too? It's like, really? You're not going to have your blinking lights in the other room? Are you going to be okay? And he just jumped in, and now it's great to see him. He goes out and presents to VM users groups on how to move your things to the cloud, which is, I mean, it's just a totally different approach. He made the conscious choice to learn and dig into this. The other gentleman decided he wanted to stay where he was.
So I think that when we were prepping for actually the show and he told me this story, I was so excited to hear it, mostly because I think this may be the most important thing, for certainly in this episode, but maybe even this entire series, because I think that this is one of the great challenges in front of folks in IT in particular, I think increasingly in business in general, but being willing to make that choice, to go a different direction, to take another path, to learn something new, to put yourself out there and to embrace that. And I think it's that choice and it's that reshaping of the identity. I was talking to a CIO yesterday, and we were talking about this was his greatest concern for his staff, is that over the next few years there's going to be this massive shift, and are they going to be ready to make that choice? And so I'm curious, Doug, we'll start with you this time. I mean, have you seen this play out? I know you do some consulting. By the way, I saw that smile when he was talking about Manning, because the other Indianapolis guy here. That was pretty funny, you know, you guys and your football. But anyway, I know you've done some consulting. Are you seeing this with your clients? Have you experienced some of this yourself? I mean, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I'll break it down. I see a lot of times with clients this fear of the unknown. And you know, part of what I see my role in that regard is making it a safe environment to learn. When I do consulting kind of engagements where we're trying to figure out how to do a process that might be new to my client, or you know, might represent a pretty significant departure over what they're doing today, I always put up a slide full of ground rules and just talks about how we're going to interact. One of my ground rules that I always talk about is that you have permission to learn. And I think that's key. Giving yourself permission to learn, which means you allow yourself to make some mistakes. You allow yourself to experience something from a different perspective. You're not going to be ridiculed or punished or ostracized or whatever the term might be just because you kind of step out on a limb. And I think that's very critical if we were to actually to achieve other things. I know personally, to answer the second part, I've gone through this myself, and I kind of looked at it in a couple of different ways. In fact, I wrote a blog article on it here recently, where you have to kind of let go of some of the things that you're currently hanging on to today in order to reach out and get that new knowledge or get that new skill set. You've got, it's one of the ways that I personally find motivation to learn and continue to engage and be challenged and hopefully grow as a professional.
And we'll give you the plug there. I'm sorry, I forgot. Is it DougTedder.com? Is that where you're posting these?
DougTedder.com. I stayed up really late to come up with a URL, and that's when I came up with.
Good. So now, Will, let's talk about it. I think Doug hit on something that is pretty critical here, right? This idea of giving yourself permission to learn, and he translated that, I think, importantly, to the permission to make mistakes. Now, you're on the other end of this, right? You're a CIO, you've got a staff, and I think this is a pretty scary proposition for a lot of folks that are employees that work inside enterprise-type organizations where they feel like they can't make mistakes. There's a lot of times that fear of making a mistake and the consequences that can happen. So I'm curious how you are combating this or how you're dealing with this within your teams and within your experience. I know you've worked in both large organizations and smaller ones, so I'm curious how you've seen this play out.
Well, I love this clip as well that we just played from Jeff. One, I'm a Giants fan, so I know what Super Bowl he was talking about. But second to that is exactly what you said, Charlie. It's so I say, so when I talk to my teams and especially my engineers, right, who are trying to be innovative and trying to really take us, so to speak, to the next level and progress the organization is, I tell them to err as human. I sometimes I make a Lost reference, the show Lost. I don't want somebody that 7 years has been just in a hangar somewhere pushing a button. I want someone that has 7 years of real experience. They've made mistakes and they've learned from those mistakes. And I encourage them to learn, implement, not in production, in a lab environment, right? And show me. But when that gets their creative juices flowing, and I have a hard time. I have a location that closes at 8 p.m. and I house my engineer in there because we're doing a lot of work, and he stays there. So I had to get the guy 24/7 access to the location because he just stays there, and he gets his mind wrapped around a project, an initiative, and he stays there. And then he turns around and he goes, "Hey, Will, I just set up VDI. Can you test it out?" And I'm like, "Hey, I can't. I'm at home. It's 9 o'clock at night. I can't log in or VPN in right now." But encouraging him and fostering that kind of culture in my organization where I encourage him to learn, I encourage him to make mistakes, and at the same time, it shifts the paradigm because at first with this particular engineer, it was me telling him, this is what we're going to do. And as he sat there and learned and gained confidence and acquired these new skills, that I just frankly don't have the time to acquire those, now it's him telling me, hey, Will, this is the direction I think we should take. And just to see that shift, just because it's embracing the culture of learning and lifelong learning, and for him to enhance his skill set, to me is one of the most self-satisfying things in my role.
So Doug, there you go. You got it now. You can advise all your other clients. We just need to go ahead and lock people in the office. Don't let them out, and you can achieve lots of great stuff. But so I'm curious, just a quick follow-up on that, Will. I mean, was there anything that you did along the way with him that made him feel comfortable? I mean, because this is something that I don't know that I have a good answer to, and that is, is this something that people instinctively have as a skill set, or is it something that as an executive, as a manager, that you have to impart on them? Is it a little bit of both? I mean, what's your take on that?
My take on it, and then with this particular individual, and it's so fresh, is the mentality and the culture that this person has worked under before was fear the rod, right? So it stifled innovation. It stifled his creative juices because he feared doing something and the boss not liking it, or the boss not being able to give him credit for it. So instead, it was sort of he wanted to be dictated to what to work on and accomplish. By me sitting here saying, no, that's not what I want. I want you to learn. I want you to turn around and teach me. So right now I'm teaching you, but I want you to learn. I'm going to send you to trainings, etc. And it really opened it up where the gentleman, he had an associate's degree. He on his own time has enrolled back in school to get his bachelor's degree. And the one thing I keep telling him is just never stop learning. So that's why I took Jeff's interview and that clip particularly to heart, because I think it's just awesome.
Well, and I think that brings us to the last clip I want to bring up, because as we look at this from a management or an executive or a leadership perspective, I think that what we've been talking about here brings to light something that sometimes I think in our corporate world we ignore, and that is that people learn differently, that we don't all learn in the same way. And so I think that's what Jeff talks about in this last clip and what I want to finish talking our conversation about today. So Corinne, play the last clip, please.
We all learn differently. I told my story. I learned from reading textbooks. If you put me in a classroom in front of a lecture, oh my God, just shoot me now, right? Some people, that's how they learn. Other people, a great example of that was when we were rolling out Google, and we kind of forgot at the front end of that people learn differently. Millennials, Gen Zs, what they want to do is they want to go watch a 30-second YouTube video, and then they're off and they know how to do it. Some of the other folks, the baby boomers like you and I, we want someone to teach us how to do that. So we had to learn from that. We learned from our mistake and set up classes for people to come in and learn how to do Google. And I always start them with, here's how you can learn about Google. You can Google, and there's lots of stuff on the internet to learn about, right? So I even try to pull them along that way, saying, hey, this is a different way to learn.
So Doug, start with you on this. I mean, I think you spend a lot of time in a lot of different companies, and I think you probably see this kind of wide swath of folks. I mean, how do you approach this, or how do you advise your clients on how they approach this in terms of the different learning modalities?
Yeah, and I think that an important point that Jeff made is that people learn differently, and so it's one of those things that I'm constantly reminding my clients is that we have to do when we're communicating or when we are teaching folks about how we want to do things differently going forward. There's an old saying, you have to say it 7 different ways, 7 different times, and it's very true. I've noticed in my personal experience, my learning style has started to shift. Whereas I was very much like Jeff, and I wanted to sit in the classroom and be lectured and that kind of thing. Now I'm starting to notice that I'm shifting a bit, and I need to see it and hear it first, and then maybe come back and take some lectures. So just based on that personal experience, that's what I've been telling my clients. Even folks, their learning styles change over time, perhaps, and we have to accommodate that if we're going to be successful.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that there's lots of different aspects to this. And in fact, I don't know that Jeff went far enough from my perspective, because I think, certainly generationally, which is what he was alluding to, we have different learning styles just in terms of how we grew up and what we were used to. I think, to your point, our learning styles can change and morph over time. And I also think the context of what we're learning or what we're teaching can change the way in which we need to teach it or learn it. I think, it's funny for me in that I personally hate, I'm much more an exploratory learner, right? I hate sitting in classrooms. I hate anyone telling me anything. I want to go and figure it out by myself and discover it and tinker it. I was the guy that, take away all the pieces and parts of my toys growing up to figure out how they worked. And, so we all have those different things. Well, I'm really curious from your perspective. Again, I think you have an interesting angle on this. You're younger than Doug and I, and you also embraced a lot of the modern technologies. For those, in fact, make sure you plug your website address as well, Will, because I know you kind of very publicly went on this journey, kind of embracing social media, embracing all of this stuff. So how have you seen the different learning modalities play out in your own life, and then how do you leverage that as you work with your teams?
Oh man, this is a great point, because I have to tie this, and I'm not going to try to get too long with it here, also into just organizational change management, project management, implementing programs or something like that nature into the organization. because the key aspect, if you're who moved the cheese, right? And when you're training people in terms of within the organization, so you have to take into account the different modalities as you mentioned. So even if I'm training my own team, myself, or just the whole organization, if I'm doing kind of what Jeff was alluding to, with they're changing from Exchange to Google Apps. Well, that's such a big change, right? And then you have people from executive admins to engineers to salespeople from all age groups, and all have a different way of learning. But you want to be able to get that productivity out of them. So you do have to sit there and have some CBTs, some trainers coming in, some people, white gloves people coming in and training, hand holding, etc. Because some people need to be visual, need to see how that change comes in. So when I saw that, that's what I thought of right off the bat. The second thing is from learning, my style is like what you said, Charlie. It's evolved. When I was younger, it's sitting in a classroom, and I was right between before they had computer-based training, and I took a few years off before I went back to school. When I went back to school and it embraced technology and it was CBTs and independent learning, that's where I learned best, as opposed to in the classroom and just not falling behind, but me looking ahead, right? Because I learned and picked things up faster than the others, and I had to sit there and twiddle my thumbs. So that's how it's impacted my career. And when I was hearing Jeff and that clip, what struck out to me was the organizational change management aspect and that training for what he was describing, meaning Exchange to Google Apps.
Yeah, no, it's very clear. I know it's been a while for me, but when we would do these major rollouts, and it's funny, right? Sometimes you do this stuff without even knowing what you're doing, but we did something very similar where we had the formal training, we had the online training, I put people out in the field to do over-the-shoulder training, right, to try to address all those different ways, and it wasn't as conscious as maybe it should have been, but we were addressing it. I want to pick up on one last thing before we wrap up. Doug, I know that speaking for us, we're not old, but the older generation, at least compared to Will here, you too have embraced social much more actively. And I think what I'm curious about is, have you found just for yourself that the approach that you take to learning has changed based on the type of, in this case, technology, that by embracing this kind of modern technology, that it changed how you approached it? Is there anything, and I guess what I'm really looking at for those folks that maybe are of an older generation, were there any tips that you can impart on them about how to step forward and embrace it and be able to adapt?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. Like Jeff, when my early learning mode was classroom based and listening to the lecture and reading the books and that kind of thing, and I still do that on occasion. But with the advent of social media and technology at your fingertips, I find myself going out and Googling or getting into some kind of social media kind of conversation, and as a result, I've noticed this shift in my learning approach. I often now will engage some folks socially, whether that's through Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever that might be, and kind of get a feel for what it's about, and then maybe go do some research or maybe then go read the books. It just helps me. I've noticed it's helped me set the context for my learning, and it seems to have expedited it. Will, God bless you. You can sit through the CBTs. I hate CBTs. I did one recently, and it was painful for me. And just having a remote-based instructor made a huge difference, just so I could have that interaction. So I've just, as my learning style has changed over the last, a lot of years, I've come to embrace the technology and different modalities for learning.
Well, I think you bring up a really interesting point that I want to highlight, and it's something we hadn't really talked about, but this idea of social learning. And I think it is a really important aspect that in our modern age, and for those of the older generations, or anyone really that is maybe feeling some trepidation, I think sometimes when we see something new, we have, maybe we won't call it this, but we're afraid of it, where it's like, I'm embarrassed, I don't understand how that thing works, I don't know what to do. And you know, but what you're pointing out is, and I found the exact same thing. If you put yourself out there and literally via LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or email, good old-fashioned email, reach out to somebody and say, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. Can you help me? People are very gracious. I mean, we've all been there. We've all gone through the same process, and people will go out of their way to help you. And you just have to recognize that this is really new for all of us. And the only difference between us and the millennials really is that because they grew up in a time in which change was so constant, it's completely natural. They're not embarrassed about figuring anything out. They just dive in and check it out, and they ask their friends, you know, hey, how does this thing work? I've never seen this. What is this? And there's no hesitation about it. And I think that's the, you know, the only real difference. So I think it's a really fascinating and prescient point. So thank you for that. And with that, that brings us, shockingly, as always, these things go so fast, to the end of our time for this Hangout. I'd like to thank today's guests, Doug Tedder and Will Lasselle. You guys provided great real-world advice and perspectives on this topic of lifelong learning that, frankly, we can all spend the rest of our lives continuing to learn about. So for those of you watching, I hope you take a moment and join in the conversation using the Twitter hashtag TransformIT. I'd love to hear what you have to think about all this. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Corinne.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much, Will, Charles, Doug. It was awesome having you guys here and having this conversation. If anyone out there in the audience wants to watch the full episode with Jeff Tunn, you can find it at digitalfuture.tv. We will make sure there is a link at the bottom of your screen. And then just so you know, the next episode, Transform IT episode, will air November 3rd, and it is with Dave Rosen. He is the CEO of Tech Foundry. You'll be able to find the episode where he is interviewed by Charlie on digitalfuture.tv starting on Tuesday. Make sure you subscribe so that way you get all future notifications of all new episodes. So thank you all for watching, and we can't wait to see you next time.